Good evening. We're going to talk about something very important. A country we have chosen has a historical relation with India. A century ago, India migrated, a lot of Indians migrated to a country and thrived as making one of the largest diaspora in the world. Now it is close to 1.4 million people. Those were the Sikh migrant there. They're prosperous in a country called Canada. And we're going to talk about India-Canada relation, and that's so important how this historical people-to-people connection matters here. Look at the bilateral trade. We have about some close to 10 billion of trades, but not that only aspect. The portfolio investment, the overall investment between India and Canada surpasses close to $100 billion, if you excuse me for that. So talk about such dimensions. We have High Commissioner of Canada, Cameron Mackay here, and he's going to talk about other issues. Despite having a thriving bilateral relation, there are hiccups also in India and Canada bilateral relations. We also focus on some of the aspects. We also see Canada plays in the geopolitics. Usually Canada is seen as a Western ally, but recently Canada has been very vocal, making its independent foreign policies, having asserting on some of the key global issues and proclaiming the rule of law across the world. Good evening, High Commissioner. Start with, as you said, we're supposed to have the grandest relation. As we see our bilateral trade, we have the largest Indian diaspora living there. Indian students make the second most choice after UK to study in Canada. I think the last year figure talks about 60,000 Indian students apply in some of the top university in Canada. Having said that, we also feel there are some hiccups, ups and downs in Indo-Canadian bilateral relations. Why is happening?
Well, let me speak a little bit about, Manish, about the people-to-people relationship between Canada and India, which is so important, as you've said. I mean, for many years, Canada is a country that's built on immigration, and for many years we've had a good, strong stream of immigrants and visitors and business visitors from India. There's now 1.5 million Indo-Canadians living and thriving in Canada in every walk of life, in film, music, art, academia, law, medicine, business and politics. People of Indian origin are really thriving in Canada. In fact, I argue that, of course, India is the most Indian country in the world, but the second most Indian country in the world is Canada. Canada has the world's largest Indian diaspora per capita, and so very influential in every aspect of Canadian life.
High Commissioner, before we talk about the key trade issues, I understand recently that Ministry of External Affairs has issued advisory for Indian students traveling in Canada. And so there is a counter advisory from the Canadian government to not to visit certain states in India and citing some of the insecurities. What are the grounds which you have made such a statement? Is it a counter statement against the Indian advisory?
So Canada's travel advisory has not changed in recent weeks or months. And I think it's very common for governments to advise their citizens when they're traveling and visiting in a country abroad, to give them advice, how to be safe and secure. If there are areas or activities that should be avoided, governments advise their citizens to do that. And the one thing that we both do, India did this last week and Canada does the same, is we advise our citizens to register with the embassy or the High Commission abroad, so that if something does go wrong, we know where these people are, we know how to contact them, so that if the embassy or the High Commission needs to help them in some regard, that we can reach out and do that. So I think this is a pretty normal, aspect of diplomacy. I will say the Indian Travel Advisory last week noted a perception on the part of the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, an uptick in sort of tensions within Canada, etc. And maybe I can just emphasize there that the Canadian government is very strong of its view that there is no place for hatred in Canada, and the law will be enforced where there is any hatred expressed between groups in Canada. So I would say, for example, just in March of this year, March 2022, There were arrests made associated with previous attacks on Sikh, Jain, and Hindu temples in Toronto, for example.
Right.
So we do enforce the law and will continue to do so.
Before I come back to this question, High Commissioner Mackay, I want to understand, for larger public, if you issue certain advisory and also applicable to the India, since we have a very close relation, of course, we are the true liberal democracies, and we are very proud of that, to having relations with Canada. Do you consult each other and talk about each other's position before issuing advisory? And the government is, like the Indian government is in understanding about that, or Canadian government is understanding about that certain advisory being issued, or how does it work? On what grounds it goes ahead?
Well, I think each country reserves for itself its own sovereignty and its own ability to issue statements and advisories to its citizens at any time. I will say that the Canadian government and the Indian government work very closely together in a wide range of areas, everything from economic cooperation, development cooperation, of course, foreign policy, political affairs, and security and intelligence. So we have a regular and ongoing dialogue with Indian government officials at all levels about every manner and aspect of our bilateral relationship. So this is all very normal.
High Commissioner, again back to the issue you also spoke about, and there's a lot of misunderstanding in India. The news we hear from Canada, and the message is that on some of the issues in Canada and some of the issues goes against India, there are certain people, the sectarian people, the extremist people who are raising anti-India slogans, who are engaged in anti-India activities. They are the minority community, even within the Indian diaspora. Recently, I'm also talking about the referendum, which were allowed by the government, despite knowing that they were engaged in anti-India activities. Despite, I know the Prime Minister has been critical on this, but how did you allow such things to happen? If you have a rule of law, your police, Canadian Mountain Police, and I'm aware, are very proud of their reputation.
Right.
Do you think such activities being allowed by the Canadian government give rise to sort of mistrust between our relationship, and how can we stop?
I think there's two important aspects here. One is that, of course, in Canada, being a democracy and a rule of law country, we have very strong protections for freedom of expression. And so people are, it's perfectly legal to say what you like about, you can criticize the Canadian Prime Minister, you can criticize the country of Canada, you're free to criticize foreign countries. This is all perfectly legal. And then on issues, for example, like separatist movements, it's perfectly legal in Canada to say that Quebec, a province in Canada, should be its own separate nation. It should separate from Canada. In fact, it's legal to have a separatist party. There are members of the Canadian Parliament and the Quebec Parliament that advocate for this. This is all perfectly legal. You can argue in Canada that Scotland should be independent, or Catalonia, etc. So this is all allowed under our freedom of expression laws. What's not allowed in Canada is incitement to violence based on discrimination, national discrimination, ethnic discrimination. This sort of thing is absolutely illegal in Canada, and we will enforce the law.
But
So incitements to violence are illegal in Canada.
But if you understand the Indian history, they were part of, they were banned as a terrorist in India long back. They instigated insurgency early in India, which we took a couple of years to curb it. It took us India a couple of 2-3 decades to raise those standards, basically.
Yeah.
And there, I understand that there are a few people there, the few extremist people there who are misguided. Such gathering under the freedom of expression is pretty valid, but that leads to certain violence, that leads to certain activities. Yeah. Those need to be checked, curbed, and strongly condemned. Why it is seen in India that Canadian government has a softer approach towards that. What is your outlook on this?
Well, anyone that advocates violence in Canada will be investigated by law enforcement authorities, and we will enforce the law. It's illegal in Canada to advocate violence or to incite violence, and those laws will be enforced.
All right. Back to the fundamental question, and that's very important that we see. India is looking for investment. It's an emerging economy, and as we said, Canada has been investing in India. It's $1 billion is a humongous amount. It is a great amount. What is the outlook? How does Canada look at India in terms of as a market, as a free economy? What is the future outlook? If you see our economic relationship.
I think we're very optimistic about the future of India's economy. It's obviously an enormous population and continues to grow. Economic growth in India has been strong, a very strong recovery so far from the COVID pandemic, etc. It'll probably be the fastest growing large economy on the planet this year and potentially for the next few years. So a lot of opportunity there. Indeed, Canadian businesses are already seeing this opportunity, as you mentioned. We already have a $100 billion bilateral commercial relationship. That's led by $70 billion of Canadian institutional investment into India. That's the big Canadian pension plans, along with private investors like Brookfield and Fairfax, using Canadian capital and Canadian savings and investment, basically to help to build India's economy even further. So roads, highways, ports, airports, pipelines, renewable energy. It's Canadian capital that's investing all across this country in all of those areas. Add to that trade in goods and trade in services, foreign direct investment, Canadian companies that have established a presence here and are manufacturing in the auto parts sector, in the high-tech sector, advanced manufacturing, food production, etc. You put all of that together, plus Indian students that you mentioned earlier, and we get to a $100 billion bilateral commercial relationship. But when you think about the size of our two economies, both G20 economies, each with multi-trillion-dollar economies, a $100 billion bilateral commercial relationship is a seriously underperforming economic relationship. We can do better, and I think that's one of the reasons why the two governments have agreed to relaunch our bilateral trade and investment negotiations just last March. And indeed, we are making progress. Round 4 of those negotiations is this week here in Delhi.
So High Commissioner, you rightly pointed out, two largest economies, a huge potential, and despite having an institutional $100 billion, but our bilateral trade per se remains within $10 billion, and that's underperforming at best, by any yardstick. What is the reason? And then we have the comprehensive partnership agreement, which again has been in the offering for a long time. Do you see that happening soon? And do you see that we could realize our potential? What are the ways we can do that?
Well, what the ministers have committed to, Minister Maryang for Canada and Minister Goyal on the Indian side, having relaunched the negotiations in March. They've had monthly phone calls up to now, and they'll continue to, I think, speak to one another even more intensively going forward to push the negotiations forward. They recognize that between our two economies, $10 billion in trade in goods, less than that, less than $10 billion in trade in services, again, is simply not enough. There remain too many tariffs, too many regulatory barriers, too many small and unimportant technical barriers to trade between the two countries, and ideally the trade negotiations will help to sweep away all but the absolutely most necessary barriers to trade so that business can do business, create more jobs, create more prosperity in both countries. That's what both governments want.
What are the challenges here? I understand, there are a few issues on agriculture and the services from the India side, we don't merge. Where do you see we can overcome that?
I think in every trade negotiation there are sensitivities on both sides, and you gave the example of agriculture. India does have some sensitivities, I understand, with respect to agricultural trade. Frankly, so does Canada in smaller areas, I would say. This is for the negotiators to negotiate at the negotiating table, and they're doing that now this week. But I think with creativity and political will, we can find ways to preserve the small amounts of protection that we need on each side, but really open up the markets much more to one another to create that prosperity and wealth that we want.
High Commissioner, one of the aspects which never figured in Indo-Canadian bilateral relation perhaps is the energy cooperation. Having known that, and this is the fact that Canada has one of the largest pool of resources,
Yeah.
energy in different forms, basically. Why there is such a missing link in
Yeah.
energy cooperation? While India is the largest importer of energy, and such a cooperation can benefit India in a remarkable way,
Yeah.
contribute to the economic growth of the country, perhaps make a lot of difference in our bilateral relation. What can we do, especially? Could you highlight some of the cooperation which potentially can we do that from renewable energy to nuclear energy?
Well, I think both prime ministers and both governments really are committed to the climate change commitments that we've made under the Paris Accord. And governments are lining up behind the PMs, and businesses are doing the same to deepen our cooperation in renewable energy in particular. So, for example, I mentioned this Canadian institutional investment into India. Those investors have put billions into renewable energy in India, solar panel farms, etc., across the country. Just this week, the Renewable Energy India Expo is happening here in Delhi. There's 11 Canadian companies here, basically showcasing their Canadian technology and everything from biomass and solar to energy storage, etc. Canada really is a world leader in hydrogen fuel cell technology, for example. So they're wanting to do more business in India. They're wanting to develop the technology together, maybe with Indian partners. So we're very excited about the prospects for greater cooperation in renewable energy to help us meet our climate change goals, but maybe more importantly, because this is the energy of the future. And frankly, there will be money to be made and prosperity to be had by developing further in these areas.
So such investment is under consideration,
Yeah.
or is it we are waiting for SEPA to cross through and perhaps have the broader security SEPA guarantee arrangement under the bilateral trade?
Well, let me say, I mean, businesses are definitely not waiting for SEPA. Businesses are already doing business, and again, we've got just 11 companies here this week in that particular sector. So, but I do think that if the negotiators do their job well, then we should be opening up new opportunities as well in the clean energy space through the trade negotiations.
One of the aspects again is education. A lot of Indian students, they prefer to be in Canada, and I understand it's because of the quality education, good environment, and opportunity to work. But I want to understand more about what are the policies and how they are eligible to work once they finish their study in Canada. What makes Canada so interesting for Indian students? How do you look at it? And is there something more in the offing?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is the quality of life in Canada is really very high. There's good economic opportunity in Canada. We have absolutely world-class educational institutions, which actually have helped to make the Canadian population the most educated population in the world. The OECD has said there's more Canadians with a post-secondary education than in any other country. So we have that right mix that I think attracts students from all over the world. Including in India. Just in 2021, I think we had 2.17 lakh Indian students studying in Canada, and that number will likely go up this year. So frankly, we have a good global product to offer, and we have students all over the world.
So they're allowed to work once they finish their education at master level?
So
there's some restriction on that?
We have a variety of visa programs for students coming in, but one of the things that attracts many students to Canada is that some of our visa programs allow them to work part-time while they are studying, and some of them, once they are graduated, can then stay on and work in Canada for the next few years after they've finished their degree. And frankly, then if they want to stay on and become permanent residents of Canada and ultimately citizens, there's a pathway for that as well.
High Commissioner, let us shift on geopolitics. As it's seen, Canada is a very liberal democracy, has a free market, well-thriving economy, and I've seen recently, Canada has been asserting on the global issues, and rightly so, on some of the critical issues, which you think come in the way of your values, which you propagate, and it's about the freedom of navigation, and a lot of stuff that you value in your democracy. Having said that, your security relation in India is also underperforming, like you said, in the economic way. While other countries in the region, your partners and friends in the West, US or UK, even Germany, are aligning with India for being a democracy and making sort of a greater alliance cooperation in the defense and security. Why Canada is lagging behind in reaching out to India and building a cohesive security partnership, especially in the Indo-Pacific realm, while you are a champion of democracy and liberal order?
But let me say, I mean, Canada very clearly is a champion of a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. And India obviously is a critical part of that. We have good, strong, long-standing relations between the two countries. We do have good relationships between the Canadian Armed Forces and their Indian counterparts. We'd like to deepen those even further. And so we're working very hard to find ways, pragmatic ways for us to work together to deepen our defense relationship. Including on the business side, I would say there are more than 600 Canadian companies that specialize in the defense sector. So in many cases there may be technology, et cetera, that is of interest to the Indian government and the Indian procurement system. So we want to deepen that cooperation, absolutely.
But did you think about some of the Indo-Pacific strategy, what we call, and with some other friends and allies are talking about, and especially for the India, seeing India as a mutual partner and strengthening the liberal order in the regions. It goes beyond the Indian Ocean region to larger Indo-Pacific. You don't have such strategy and you don't have such a close cooperation. Security alliances, I'd say not a military alliances, but a comprehensive alliances which talks about common values and for example, maintaining UNCLOS in the Indian Ocean or maybe in the Pacific areas.
Well, let me say that Canada very clearly is an Indo-Pacific nation. We have a long Pacific coast ourselves. We've long had great involvement all through the Pacific and including in the Indian Oceans. I think, and we absolutely want to deepen that.
Do we see some leadership talk on this? Do we see the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Prime Minister Modi talking on such lines and building blocks on this, especially on the security matters? So its time has come to do that.
So they met on the margins of the G7 summit in Germany in June of this year and had a good, strong meeting that went well over an hour, talked about the whole range of bilateral and global issues. So they have a good, strong relationship, I would say, and we look forward to continuing that.
High Commissioner, I also understand, again, the context of India as an emerging economy and trying to build up its defense capabilities. In the same line, I am fully aware of Canada has a very thriving, mature defense industrial ecosystem there. How do you see such things can be merged together? Could Canadian industry cooperate with the Indian defense industry? Is there a potential of investment and cooperation? And if some of the areas you can highlight, for example, I know this leading company called Pratt & Whitney has a great system of aero engine manufacturing in Canada. India also need and struggling in that way to have that aero engine capability for their fighter jet programs. Could such potential collaboration be strengthening our relationship? And what way?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. So Canada has quite considerable capacity in aeronautics, aviation communications, sonar, maritime domain awareness, satellite technology, et cetera. We've got a number of Canadian companies who will be participating in DEF Expo coming up just in a few weeks here in India. And so these are exactly the sorts of things that they'll be exploring with their Indian counterparts, is how can we deepen those
Could you talk about what they will be showing at the DEF Expo, some of the capabilities, especially in the aerospace sector?
So basically those sectors that I just mentioned before, and we're still trying to finalize now exactly which companies will be coming, but I think you'll see a good, strong Canadian presence there.
But yours is also a export-driven country, and as I said, the way the geopolitics is changing, the environment is changing, and some of the countries, just trying to take advantage of the liberal orders. And for you to maintain that part of your trade, especially for the sea perspective, you need to have greater collaboration, especially with the countries like India on the maritime. Have a close cooperation with the maritime, has a naval exercise, patrolling. Such things on the plan, or has it happened before recently, or is under discussion with India?
So we have had defense cooperation exercises with India and with the Quad countries before. I think the last one was 2021. It was called Operation Sea Dragon, if I remember correctly. And there will be more in the future, I have no doubt.
High Commissioner, then back to the geopolitics, Canada has been on the forefront of again being critical on some of the issues, and you have been criticizing China, especially on certain issues. I also understand recently your minister issued warning to China where the Chinese tracked your jets into the open sky, which was international under the international regulations. Basically, it violated the basic principle of navigation, and also the airspace violation. How do you look at such thing happening, and how do you mitigate that?
I think, again, Canada has tried to be a real champion of rule of law, including international rule of law and the rules-based international order. And so we absolutely want to work closely with like-minded countries and with allies to make sure that the rules are respected and that the rules are enforced.
But to enforce that, you have to have some mechanism. We have a mechanism called Quad, which we align with the friendly countries like yours, but then you are not part of that. So how do you enforce such things? If you're not part of such mechanism, you're not part of the joint exercises, you don't sit together, say in the context of India.
I'll give you the example of the sanctions on North Korea, for example, that there are United Nations sanctions on North Korea, and the Canadian Navy absolutely cooperates with like-minded navies and allied navies to help to enforce those sanctions. So where we can play a pragmatic role in helping to enforce the rule of law, including on the high seas, we will absolutely be doing so.
So we see some more collaboration happening on security front, some concrete steps being taken down the line?
I'm looking forward to that, yeah.
In some of the area like maritime or exercises?
Absolutely, yeah, we're absolutely open to all of that. We're, again, working with like-minded partners and allies wherever we can to enforce the law.
And High Commissioner, of course, towards the end of our interview, it's important to ask you whether, because again, a lot of Indians, students are looking forward for the next term to have their education, to build up their career, and look forward to your country, Canada. Having seen this advisory in the background, they have some apprehensions. What is the message for them? How should they feel about applying to Canada, studying there, building their future, and building the future of our bilateral relation, the High Commissioner?
Yeah. Well, frankly, I think that young Indians who travel to Canada to further their education should feel absolutely safe in Canada. We want them to feel safe, and the Indian government does as well. I think I've really had an emphasis, you've seen just in the last few minutes in talking about the enforcement of the rule of law. We're very committed to that, including on the streets in Canada. So I think the young Indians should feel safe on the streets in Canada. We look forward to welcoming more of them so that they can further their education in Canada, so they can prosper in Canada, so they can come back and prosper in India and work to basically help to make both of our nations more prosperous and safe.
And again, fundamentally, back to the vital question of why you are having a discussion with SEPA, the ministers having a talk, our ministers is on the regular touch basically. But then, it took such a long time. Do you see this will continue to happen? And when it will culminate, do you see any? Do you have any deadline
for the trade negotiations?
For the trade negotiations to happen, which will unlock so much of potential, and how bullish you are this to happen, at the government level?
So we actually first launched our trade negotiations more than 12 years ago, and we really made no progress for many years. But we relaunched in March. We're round 4 this week, and we've made more progress since March than we did in the previous 12 years. So we're absolutely moving ahead. There's still some difficult issues, I think, for the negotiators to crunch, but both ministers are very dedicated to getting the deal done. They have committed to having first an early progress trade agreement in APTA.
High Commissioner, last question, of course, again, your voice in the geopolitics is important, and you have been critical of some of the issues that are said in the past. How do you look at India and China relations, especially when China violating Indian land status quo? What is your opinion in the whole area and the whole situation?
So we expect all countries to abide by the UN Charter and to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other nations. That's Canada's view.
Thank you here, High Commissioner Cameron Mackay. Thank you, High Commissioner, so much.
Thank you very much.
Manish, Kumar, Javed, cameraman. Amrindu Mishra, Financial Express. Thank you.